What if I told you that one man, working out of a dusty, half-lit garage deep in rural Tennessee, figured out how to squeeze nearly 700 horsepower from a Chrysler Hemi using a fuel so illegal that even the factory engineers refused to touch it? Not because they couldn't, but because they never imagined it. This isn't a legend told over beers. This isn't some exaggerated backwoods myth. And it definitely isn't corporate engineering at work. This is the true story of Wendell Scott, a moonshine runner turned racer, who used outlaw chemistry, mechanical instinct, and relentless determination to outthink Detroit's best minds and rewrite what an American V8 was capable of. Picture this. It's 1965. A small, forgotten drag strip carved into the Tennessee countryside. Dust hangs in the air. The smell of burned rubber mixes with raw gasoline and hot metal. In the staging lanes sit big block Mopars, Fords and Chevys. Chrome shining, paint polished, hoods open. Their owners lean against fenders, talking numbers, cam duration, compression ratios, how much money they spent to get there. Then something doesn't fit. A beat-up Plymouth Belvedere rolls into the lane. Primer gray, rust showing through. Mismatched wheels that look like they came from 3 different junkyards. No shine, no polish, no intimidation. Behind the wheel is Wendell Scott, a black man in a sport that, especially in the Deep South, is almost entirely white. Conversations stop. People stare. A few laugh. Some don't bother hiding their smirks. They see the car. They see the driver. And they make assumptions, big ones. Then the light turns green. That Plymouth launches like it's been fired from a battleship cannon. The front wheels lift clean off the ground. The rear tires bite so hard they wrinkle. In less than a second, Scott is already pulling away from cars that cost 3 times as much. By the 8th mile, it's not even a contest. The laughter disappears. The smirks vanish. Nobody's talking anymore because something just happened that doesn't make sense. What they don't know, what nobody suspects, is that Wendell Scott isn't running gasoline. He's pouring moonshine straight into his fuel tank, and that single illegal decision changed American racing forever. To understand how insane this really was, we need to rewind to 1964, the year Chrysler unleashed what would become one of the most legendary engines in automotive history, the 426 Hemi. Even by modern standards, the Hemi was a monster. Chrysler engineers spent millions developing it for NASCAR dominance. This wasn't a warmed-over street engine. It was a purpose-built racing weapon disguised as a production motor. The hemispherical combustion chambers were revolutionary. They allowed massive valves, 2.25-inch intake valves and 1.94-inch exhaust valves, numbers that still turn heads today. The valve angle, set at 58 degrees, maximized airflow like nothing else on the market. More air meant more fuel meant more power. The street version, released in 1966, was officially rated at 425 horsepower and 490 pound-feet of torque. Unofficially, most dyno pulls showed closer to 470 horsepower. Compression was set at 10.25 to 1, a carefully calculated number, high enough to make serious power, low enough to survive on 91-octane pump gas. Go any higher and detonation would destroy pistons faster than you could lift off the throttle. Chrysler engineers tested everything: timing curves, carburetor jetting, camshaft profiles, fuel quality. They documented it all. But there was one thing they never tested: alcohol. Because alcohol fuel didn't belong in street cars. It was corrosive. It required completely different air-fuel ratios. It attacked rubber fuel lines, carburetor floats, seals, everything. Running alcohol in a gasoline engine wasn't just unconventional, it was considered reckless. But Wendell Scott wasn't a Chrysler engineer. He was a moonshiner. Long before trophies and drag strips, Scott ran illegal liquor through the hills of Tennessee and Virginia, and in that world you learned lessons no engineering school ever taught. You learned what happened when engines overheated at full throttle. You learned which fuels resisted knock. You learned how to extract power when your freedom depended on it. Moonshiners knew something Detroit didn't. Pure grain alcohol, the kind that came out of a good still at 190 proof, had incredible anti-knock properties. It burned cooler than gasoline. It resisted detonation even under brutal compression. And if you wanted to outrun federal agents on backroads at night, you needed every horsepower possible. Alcohol fuel isn't magic, but the physics behind it are beautiful. Ethanol has an octane rating of roughly 113. That alone is impressive. But the real advantage comes from what happens when it evaporates. Alcohol absorbs massive amounts of heat as it changes from liquid to vapor. That evaporation cools the intake charge during the compression stroke. Cooler air is denser. Denser air carries more oxygen. More oxygen means more power. That cooling effect allows compression ratios that would be suicidal on gasoline, 14:1, even 15:1. Scott didn't learn this from a white paper. He learned it from broken parts, late nights, and hard experience. His fuel formula was brutally simple: half 190 proof Moonshine, half high-test gasoline. That blend produced an effective octane rating north of 120. To put that in perspective, today's premium pump gas is 93. Typical race gas is around 110. Scott was running fuel that made race gas look weak. But fuel alone wasn't enough. Alcohol requires about 40% more fuel volume than gasoline. So Scott tore into his carburetor. Primary jets jumped from 72s to 85s. Secondaries from 76s to 92s. These weren't small changes, they were massive. Timing changed too. Factory recommendation was 36 degrees total. Scott ran 42, sometimes 44. Then came the most dangerous modification of all: compression. Scott rebuilt the Hemi with custom pistons, pushing compression to 14:1. On pump gas, the engine would have destroyed itself in seconds. On Moonshine, it came alive. Throttle response sharpened. Cylinder pressure skyrocketed. The engine didn't just make more power, it made power everywhere. The results shocked everyone. While factory Hemis made 425 to 470 horsepower, Scott's engine put down over 600 horsepower at the rear wheels. Not flywheel horsepower. Not brochure numbers. Not optimistic estimates. Measured power at the tires. That means nearly 700 horsepower at the crank, naturally aspirated in 1965. The competition had no explanation. They heard it first. Scott's engine sounded different, sharper, angrier, almost metallic. Then they smelled it. Alcohol exhaust carries a sweet, almost pleasant scent compared to gasoline. But drag racing was built on secrets. As long as you weren't running nitromethane, nobody asked questions. Scott's first major victory came at a small strip outside Knoxville. His opponent was a local hero running a fully built 427 Ford with all the best parts money could buy. The Ford driver laughed when he saw Scott's Plymouth. He stopped laughing when Scott ripped a 1.42 second 60-foot time, numbers most racers only dreamed of. The Plymouth lifted the front wheels 6 inches off the ground and crossed the 8th mile 3 car lengths ahead. Scott ran 10.84 at 128 miles per hour. The Ford managed 11.92. It wasn't close. It wasn't lucky. It was domination. Word spread fast. Who was this guy, and what was he hiding under that hood? Some suspected nitrous. Others whispered about a secret race Hemi. A few accused him of cheating. Nobody guessed the truth. Alcohol fuel brought brutal challenges. It absorbed water from the air. Let it sit too long and it separated. Scott mixed fresh fuel before every race. Alcohol destroyed rubber fuel lines. Carburetor floats failed without warning. Fuel pumps cavitated. Scott solved every problem. Aircraft-grade fuel lines. Custom carb floats made from closed cell foam. Modified fuel pumps with stiffer springs and larger valves. There were no instruction manuals, no forums, no experts to call. Everything was learned the hard way. Heat management became the next battle. Alcohol burned cooler than gasoline, but 14:1 compression and aggressive timing created extreme combustion pressures. Scott drilled additional coolant passages in the block. He ran a high-flow motorhome water pump. He ditched antifreeze for straight water with additives. And then came his smartest trick. He used the alcohol itself as a coolant. As the fuel evaporated in the intake manifold, it dropped intake temperatures by nearly 80 degrees. Cooler charge, denser air, more power. By mid-1965, Wendell Scott was nearly unbeatable across Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia. especially at outlaw strips where fuel checks didn't exist. His reputation turned mythical. Stories spread about outrunning police during moonshine runs, about secret test sessions at abandoned airfields, about fuel formulas passed down through generations. The truth was simpler and smarter. He studied chemistry textbooks. He understood combustion. He knew exactly why it worked. Alcohol's latent heat of vaporization, 396 BTUs per pound compared to gasoline's 142, was the secret. Scott wasn't guessing. He was calculating. That mindset carried him into NASCAR. Fuel rules there were strict. Everyone ran the same gasoline. But Scott's approach, doing more with less, transferred perfectly. While teams spent thousands in wind tunnels, Scott taped yarn to his car and drove back roads watching airflow. While others hired engineers, Scott trusted instinct sharpened by necessity. Years later, Chrysler would build alcohol Hemis making over 800 horsepower, but those were purpose-built race engines. Scott did it first with mostly stock parts and moonshine. In 1965, 600 horsepower meant something different. A Shelby Cobra made 425 horsepower and cost a small fortune. A Ferrari struggled to make 300. Scott's Plymouth, bought used for $1,800, made more power than both. But it came at a price. Running moonshine as fuel risked federal prison. Alcohol fires burned nearly invisible. Scott carried specialized fire extinguishers and installed an aircraft-style suppression system. He wasn't reckless. He was prepared. His most legendary night came in Bristol, 1965. Heads-up racing. No handicaps. No excuses. Big block Chevys. Stroked Fords. Other Hemis. Scott won 7 races in a row. Best pass, 10.72 at 131 miles per hour. Power to weight, better than a modern Z06 Corvette. Detroit noticed. Engineers quietly observed. Factory racing parts soon reflected ideas Scott pioneered. By 1967, alcohol classes appeared at dragstrips across America. One moonshiner changed the sport. Today, E85 exists for the same reason Scott used moonshine, cooler combustion, higher octane, more power. The difference? It's legal now. Scott didn't just beat racers. He beat assumptions. He proved innovation doesn't always come from laboratories. Sometimes it comes from necessity, courage, and the willingness to ignore limits others never questioned. So here's the real question. What limits are you still accepting just because someone told you they exist? Drop a comment below with the wildest fuel or engine setup you've ever heard of. And if stories like this fire you up, stories where ingenuity beats money, hit that subscribe button, because this channel is built for people who refuse to accept impossible, and we're just getting started.